So Adam, welcome to Sovereign Strategies London headquarters on what is a very momentous time for the United Kingdom. But as you know, there's a lot of interest externally also in what's happening with the election campaign. But the critical thing, I think, is that you hosted the 2010 debate between the three party leaders when Gordon Brown was Prime Minister. And that seemed to be a game changer. Do you think the party leader debates have the same impact today?
I don't think they have the same formal impact, because then all the broadcasters collaborated on three major events, which, according to David Cameron, dominated the campaign to the extent that they sucked it out. But what we have seen is a series of debates. We've had two encounters involving the two main party leaders, the leader of Labour, Keir Starmer, and the leader of the Conservatives, Rishi Sunak. But we've also seen, because the UK is a diverse nation, we've seen two debates with multi-headed 7 representatives of parties, including the Welsh and the Scottish Nationalists, the Greens, and also Reform UK. Now, this was something that I don't think anyone saw before the election would have such an influence, because Reform UK was at that stage not led by Nigel Farage. And it seemed like those debates would be pretty much going through the motions to make sure all the parties were represented. I think the fact that Nigel Farage, who in terms of performance is probably the most skilled politician in this country, certainly the most skilled party leader at the moment, has really changed the dynamic. And it does appear that as a result of the extra coverage, particularly in the debates, that the other parties, not Labour and Conservative, are getting, that they appear to have moved the polls in their favour, not changing the difference between Labour and the Conservatives, but certainly making them look more viable and also making them the story during the election campaign. As you know, in election campaigns, there's always the danger of a bandwagon starting rolling.
And in terms of the election being called on July the 4th, there's speculation that this was to try and take home by surprise. But in fact, it seems to have hastened Farage's return to the campaign. I mean, do you think that was the reason for the 4th of July election?
Well, I certainly think it was one of Rishi Sunak's calculations. And as you say, it's backfired badly, because what in fact happened was Nigel Farage got a week of coverage because he wasn't standing and was saying that he was going to go to America to work with Donald Trump. And then the next week he said he was standing, so he got another week of coverage, and now he's out there as a party leader. So that certainly has given Reform some momentum. I personally think the main reason why the election was called unexpectedly early was because Rishi Sunak feared that he wouldn't be able to hold the Conservative Party together into the autumn or the winter.
And in this final debate on the 26th of June, what does Rishi Sunak have to do if there's going to be a game changer?
I think the real game changer would be a very, very bad night for Sir Keir Starmer on the other side. I think, Rishi Sunak has performed reasonably competently, but not really had any impact on public opinion. And the public appears to be warming towards the idea of Keir Starmer as Prime Minister, but he's certainly not inspiring or exciting people. And if perhaps Rishi Sunak in argument can convince the general public that Keir Starmer really is a closet lefty who's going to jack up their taxes dramatically, or if Keir Starmer is embarrassed and says something seriously stupid, I think those are the two things that could change the course of the debate. I have to say, I don't have high expectations that that's going to happen, because Sir Keir Starmer may not be a great debater, but he is an extremely experienced courtroom lawyer, and he's not someone who tends to put a foot wrong.
And do you get any sense of what's happening in Scotland? Because for Labour to win, I think it's clear that Labour have to pick up seats in Scotland.
Yeah, I mean, the interesting thing about Scotland is that, like the Conservative Party here, who've had 3 prime ministers in a couple of years, They've also had 3 first ministers and leaders of the SNP in a couple of years. So the SNP looked pretty discredited. In their case, it does seem that the change of leader to John Swinney, who was a very well-known figure, but not really associated that closely with the kind of excesses of Alex Salmond or Nicola Sturgeon, has steadied the ship for the SNP, not dramatically. Latest polling suggests the SNP and the Labour Party are more or less even. And that suggests that Labour will pick up perhaps up to 20 seats from the SNP, but it won't be a dramatic wipeout, which really would seal the deal, if you like, for Sir Keir Starmer.
And this latest opinion poll from YouGov has Reform 1 point ahead of the Conservatives. I mean, do you think that's an outlier, or do you think that's a direction of travel?
Well, it is an outlier because we've had other polls that haven't picked up on that. I mean, one of the complicating things about this election, I'm sorry to get technical, is that YouGov have changed the way in which they're conducting polls in the middle of the campaign, so you can't really compare like with like. But what is pretty clear is that over the past week or so, the Reform Party and the Liberal Democrats have picked up a point or two. That's in the poll of polls, averaging it out. So what happens with this so-called crossover poll is that it's attracted a lot of attention. Everyone's talking about it. And again, that kind of legitimizes enthusiasm for reform, or people saying, I'm going to vote reform. I mean, you know, one of the odd things that struck me during this campaign, speaking to Labour canvassers, is they are encountering a lot of disillusioned Conservatives on the doorstep who are saying, I'm not going to vote for the Conservatives. But quite a lot of them are saying, actually, it's a toss-up between whether I vote for Reform or whether I vote for Labour. And obviously it helps Labour that they don't vote for the Conservatives. But, you know, if a lot of ex-Labour supporters, and people talk about the Red Wall, you know, people in working class constituencies, feel now that Reform is the coming game in town, that could really affect the election in unexpected ways.
Yeah, and of course in 1999, when Farage was elected to the European Parliament, people thought it was all a bit of a joke. And of course, 2016, he got his wish, which was for Britain to leave the European Union.
Yeah, I mean, you know, there's always argument as to whether the voters in the UK took European Parliament elections seriously, but Nigel Farage actually has a unique record. He has twice led the party that he's in charge of to the top of the poll in the European Parliament elections. He won the election in 2014, I think with about 29%. He then won again in 2019, even though Britain was on its way out of the European Union, with over 30%. And what one can say is that the first one put the pressure on David Cameron to call the referendum, which he did. The second one really helped Boris Johnson go for a hard Brexit, if you like, not really seeking to have any ties to the European Union ongoing. And we can still see the influence of that in the fact that Labour, which is a nominally pro-European party, is ruling out re-entering the customs union or re-entering the single market because it's looking at it over its shoulder at where Reform and Conservative voters that it might want to bring over may be heading.
Now, the Conservatives are clearly now focused on, as they have in the past, on the whole issue of tax and whether there is a tax bombshell there for if a Labour government was elected. Do you think that's going to be the key theme between now and polling day for the Conservatives?
I think it's certainly what they are trying to hit, and we've seen certainly Penny Mordaunt, who they put in the multi-party debates, wanting to hit that, and we've also seen Rishi Sunak saying, you know, vote for Labour and your taxes will go up. And that has worked for them in the past. I mean, you and I will remember the 1992 Conservative victory where they came up with this idea of the tax bombshell. The point was that then there really was a tax bombshell, that John Smith's shadow budget with Gordon Brown was proposing putting up taxes for most middle earners, and the Conservatives could legitimately say, you know, your taxes aren't going to go up under us. This time round, any independent analysis shows that the overall tax take in this country is going to go up in the next Parliament over the next 5 years, whether or not you vote Labour or Conservative. That is a problem for the Conservatives. And although they are saying we are cutting taxes, they put in place already changes in income tax thresholds, which means that in real terms, people will be paying more tax. Most people will be paying more tax. So it's much harder for them to make that argument stick. And Labour, the one interesting thing Labour has done is that it has not gone right down the road of saying we will match the Conservatives for tax cuts. It's actually proposed some limited increases in taxes, targeted VAT, purchase tax on private education to invest the money into state schools, nationally run schools, and also increasing the pressure on non-DOMs to get more money from them. So Labour is saying we're going to put up taxes, but by a very small amount, according to the Independent Institute for Fiscal Studies. So what that means is the Conservatives are challenging Labour again and again and again to say, well, what about this tax? Would you put that up? But it appears that Labour is quite confident in saying, we've agreed with you, we're not going to put up the rates of income tax, VAT and national insurance, but we don't see any need to go any further. That does leave them some wiggle room, but you have to remember that Keir Starmer is also saying there are no plans, a formula which doesn't necessarily mean you won't do it, to put up tax because he believes he can stimulate more growth. And you know, the long and the short of it is that I don't think the tax attack is really registering with voters, A, because they're cynical about taxes going up anyway, and B, because all the other parties other than Conservatives are running a Broken Britain campaign about poor public services. And if you said to people, would you prefer a tax cut or better schools and hospitals? It's pretty clear that in polling they would go for the schools and hospitals.
And how important do you think the whole immigration policy is presently in the campaign? And will it, I mean, has it been important for the 18% who say they're going to vote reform? And is it one of the reasons why Conservatives are switching?
Yeah, it is very important because basically it is the only clear cause which Nigel Farage and Reform putting at the centre of their campaign. They keep on saying that the country is being swamped by immigrants, can't afford it, that is leading to shortages in schools and hospitals and public services. And so Nigel Farage is no longer really campaigning on an anti-Europe ticket. He's switched to immigration, which has quite a lot of populist appeal. Now, the Conservatives have recognised that and tried to accommodate that with their very performative policy of putting illegal migrants onto planes to Rwanda. They insist that that would be a deterrent. The problem with it is first of all, it would only deal with a very small proportion of the number of total migrants, legal and illegal, so-called, coming to this country. Secondly, there are many, many legal problems around having a substantial Rwanda policy, and it is very, very expensive. So it does appear that in spite of leaning very heavily on this performative stop the votes policy, it is not something that has persuaded a lot of voters that the Conservatives have got a grip on immigration. And indeed, over the last 2 years, overall immigration has been at record levels. Interestingly, something which Nigel Farage said that Brexit would stop, but he's not taking the blame for it. He's managing to put the blame on the government.
As you say, he's a very adept politician.
Yeah.
Paddy Ashdown famously in 2015 said that if a particular opinion poll that he saw was correct, he'd eat his hat. And I think he had to eat his hat. What would make you eat your hat on the 5th of July?
I sort of tend to sympathise with politicians who, as you know, like to say, Alan, there's only one poll that matters, it's the vote on polling day. But I do think that the industry as a whole has got a great deal better in this country than it used to be. More doubts about America. And I think you have to take polls seriously about the direction of travel. As everyone says, it's best to aggregate out what happens. And what I think is interesting in this election, and really it's been a phenomenon this century in the UK and reflected elsewhere, is that the electorate is extremely volatile. So you can see a range of unexpected outcomes.
They're not as tribal anymore.
They're not as tribal. There aren't, economic reasons why people should identify in the same way. And as I said, we did see UKIP coming top of the poll, not getting a majority in European Parliament. So so in other words, I've been very cautious about predictions. What would make me eat my hat? I did think at the beginning of this campaign that reform would fade away. And I obviously, I would have to eat my hat over that because clearly they are now significant players.
And do you think Farage will win his seat?
That is what the polling analysts say. It has been held before at an election by UKIP, a predecessor party of reform, by Douglas Carswell, who was the incumbent MP and who defected. So it's certainly possible. And there are a couple of local issues that might help Nigel Farage. Although he's backed Boris Johnson since the referendum, the incumbent Conservative MP was actually a Remainer, and also the Labour MP, a Labour candidate who stands very little chance, is black and has talked about drinking the tears of white people, rather sarcastically, something Nigel Farage has drawn his attention to. So without having to be overtly racist, it is a card which Farage can play.
You and I have both seen many elections over probably too many years, and I know that you've got lots of stories that will be in your mind. I know you were in the United States too for a time. In terms of Britain, I mean, is there a story that you like to talk about over dinner? Something that either shocked you or surprised you, or?
Well, one of the fun things about doing election night programs is the exit poll. And this is when all the broadcasters club together to do a big survey during polling day. And you have a result that comes out at 10 o'clock as the polls close. And as I was saying earlier, the pollsters have got a lot more accurate in what they do. So I do tend to believe in the exit poll, partly because I have spent some nights, election nights, arguing with our professor, Professor Michael Thrasher, our expert, saying, Michael, this poll can't possibly be right. And he always says, just wait for the results. And he's tended to be proved right. Now, in fact, the way they gather the data through the day is that they tell me that round about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, they know which way the polls are going.
And they feel they know about it.
Yeah. And in the sort of political world, and obviously with some of the broadcasters, the sort of news starts circulating. And in the case of the BBC, who participated in this poll, they actually get pretty much the definitive result they're going to announce at 10, about an hour before, and they brief all their people. So there's always a lot of argument about whether someone's tweeted someone or told their favourite political party what the result is. Because of this, but also because I just love live broadcasting, when I've been doing that job, I've always said, don't tell me. I will literally read it off the auto cue. For me, the way my brain works is easier just to respond to something. And it is very interesting because a couple of times my producers have come to me and said, "You sure you want to do this?" You know, and that's normally because they're surprised what the exit poll says.
Yeah.
So you have to. I don't think the people on other channels do the same thing, but I just love that excitement, that gamble of not knowing and taking the story from there. And incidentally, I think that's one of the keys for broadcasting on election nights, is to go with the story, not the preconceived story that you had as to what's going to happen.
That's interesting, because I remember in the 92 election,
Yeah.
there was a journalist called Vincent Hanna, who was the anchor on Channel 4.
Yeah.
And he was telling of the intelligence was that Neil Kinnock had won the election.
Yeah.
So it all went downhill after about 2 hours.
Well, I have to say, the late Vincent Hanna, you know, who's a friend of both of ours, was a great man, but he also used to do polling at by-elections, you know, off-year elections, and I think it was after that series of incidents that John Burt, who was then the boss of the BBC, ordered a full inquiry into what had been going on. And actually, subsequently from then, it's when the polls started being, the pollsters started being a bit more authoritative and a bit more careful, perhaps.
Adam, thanks very much for your time.
Thank you.